This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about the Nostratic Hypothesis. This was originally a listener suggestion on Twitter, and I wanted to start out by thanking all of you that have sent me suggestions either on Twitter or via email. I've gotten quite a lot of them, and I do expect to make episodes out of most of them, if not all of them. I have been a little bit busier than normal, and that's why I've been a little bit slow in producing new episodes, but hopefully I've got everything under control now, and so I'll be able to record some new stuff for all of you to listen to. Now, this episode, as I said, was a suggestion by a listener who was interested in looking at words for mother across languages, because there's actually a seemingly strange thing going on with mother across languages. So let me start there. Okay, now obviously if we think about the word mother and we think about Indo-European languages, we find things like mère in French, we have Mutter in German, very, very M-like words for mother. And of course that's due to the fact that they come ultimately from a common root in Indo-European. So if we think back to what I mentioned on, I think, one of the earlier podcasts about historical linguistics, that languages there are language families, and ultimately a family is a group of languages which share the same mother. So all Indo-European languages would share Proto-Indo-European as their mother, even though there is no written record of Proto-Indo-European. That would be the hypothesis based on available linguistic data and what we know about how languages change. So the fact that we have words for mother in Indo-European languages starting with the bilabial nasal is not surprising. Okay, so it means that the bilabial nasal was there in Proto-Indo-European in whatever word they used for mother, whatever it may have been. What is interesting is that if you look outside of Indo-European, you still see quite a lot of nasal consonants. Okay, so you don't necessarily see all of them beginning with M, but you do see a lot of nasals in general, so M, N, Nya, Ang, right, the Engma sound, the velar nasal. You see those sounds, and you don't always see them at the beginning, but you do see them somewhere in the word, generally speaking. Now, I don't have an official number of what percentage of languages share this feature in their words for mother, but it is an appreciable amount. I'll just say that much. It was enough for historical linguists to take notice of this and start to wonder about why this may have been the case, why you have all these nasals around in words for mother. So that's the beginning of the story, and now I'm actually going to sort of jump to the end and then finish up with the middle, and that'll make sense in a second. This kind of thinking led to working towards the MonoGenesis Hypothesis, which says that if you go far enough back in language history, you end up with a single language, which would have come about from some tribe somewhere. In fact, I believe it's in southeastern Africa is where it's thought to have originated from. But that tribe developed some sort of communication system, and all human languages are derived from that original communication system. So in other words, that tribe developed this system, portions of the tribe migrated, and the system, the two now unique populations, distinct populations, started changing their systems in ways different from each other, a typical language change situation. And over time, you have migrations and migrations and migrations, and separations and separations and separations, and eventually you end up with different languages, not just different dialects, but mutual unintelligibility, different dialects becoming different languages. And this leads over years and years and years and years, according to this MonoGenesis hypothesis, to all the language families we see around the world. And as it turns out, one of the sort of artifacts of this is the fact that there still exists a nasal in most of the words for mother across the world's languages. Right? So this would be an artifact of that first language from whence everything else comes, had a nasal in its word for mother. That's the argument that the purveyors of this hypothesis would make. Now, this hypothesis isn't just out in the air all willy-nilly. It's called the Nostratic Hypothesis. Nostratic meaning having to do with the nos root, right? So nos in Latin meaning hours. Nostratic says that human languages all can come down to a single language if you go far enough back. And it's an interesting hypothesis, okay? But in and of itself, if we were just looking at words for mother, there wouldn't be enough evidence to come to that hypothesis. So the question is, how did they get there? And this is, I think, the most interesting part of the Nostratic hypothesis, is that you can look at words which have something to do with mothering. In other words, you broaden your scope a little bit, and you find that the similarities across languages get even better than just looking at mother alone. So like I said, with mother alone, you have this thing where nasals seem to be there a lot of the time. However, if you broaden your scope to not mother, but words having to do with milk, okay, so this is a clear association with mothering. If you think of breast milk, breastfeeding, words having to do with milk actually have some pretty startling correlations if we look across some of the world's languages. So the idea here is that you had an original word in Nostratic. For some reason I find it difficult to say that without tapping the R, doing a little trill. Nostratic. Kind of a Latinate sounding word there. It's awkward. I've never realized I did that until now. So okay, let me get back on track. So the idea here is that in Nostratic, I'm trying hard to use the American English R there, Nostratic, you have one word for milk, which now has artifacts in all these other words for milk, or things having to do with milk, in these languages around the world. So, first, let's see, what's a good one here? Well, obviously, English milk, right? We all know that word, and you compare it to Hungarian mel, not far off. Now, mel in Hungarian, or male, means breast in Hungarian. So breast, milk, very similar. Okay. Sami, mielga. Okay, that also means breast. Now, both Sami and Hungarian are Uralic, so you say, well, mielga, mel, those are related, and maybe there's some contact with, Germanic, and that's why milk and mel and mielga seem very similar to each other. Now, if we look in the Dravidian language family, we find that there's a word melku, which means to chew. Now, chewing doesn't have anything to do with milk, obviously, but it does have something to do with the mouth, which in terms of breastfeeding has something to do with babies. So that's interesting. Okay, and then you also have meluka in Malayalam, is the language, which also means to chew. So the first one was Tamil, the second one was Malayalam. Okay, so that's somewhat interesting. Alright, now if we go to the Afroasiatic family, we find that the Arabic consonantal root for to suck is M, L, and Y. So again, the M and the L, just like we had mel, just like we have in milk, or German milch, there seems to be a strong pattern here, right? With at least the M and the L, and oftentimes some sort of K sound or some sort of velar consonant sound. it gets even stranger when you go further away. Okay, so if we go, for example, to the Eskimo-Aleut family, Central Yupik. Okay, so this is a very distant language family, especially from Indo-European. We find that the prefix chisuk is meluk. Meluk. Very similar there, especially for being so distant. Of course, when I say distant, what I'm alluding to is the fact that contact between the Eskimo-Aleut family and Indo-European, for example, is very unlikely. Okay, recent contact is very unlikely. In terms of language change, obviously now everybody talks to everybody, but back in the day, as it were, these were areas that would not have contacted each other. Certainly not enough to make changes in a basic word like milk or to suck or something like that. If we look at the Amarant family, again, a language family of the Americans, we find some examples like milk for throat. We find umulk to swallow. We find mook, milk, malki, milky, murki, malka, mirko. I'm just naming off different examples from different languages in that family. What's interesting is they all have something to do with either sucking, milk, throat, something like that. Okay, something that can be related to breastfeeding in some way. Okay, that is the Nostratic Hypothesis in a nutshell. Okay, the original form, according to the purveyors of the hypothesis, is malika. Malika. That's what they would put their money on for the original word in Nostratic for milk, I suppose, or perhaps to suckle. So that's very interesting, right? I mean, we're talking about long-distance similarities among languages. You don't often see that to such an extent. Now, that's not to say that it's a theory. It's still a hypothesis. There's a lot you can do to sort of break this hypothesis. In other words, you don't see similarities like this just everywhere. But it is interesting to think about it. It certainly makes you look twice when you see a listing of words that are so similar to each other among families that are so distant. Now let me go back to the middle. So we started off by saying there seems to be similarity among words for mother. We ended by saying there's this hypothesis where they've taken this all the way and they've said, okay, well, we're going to say there's one original language called Nostratic, and it has this word malika, and from that we get words like milk or suckle in other languages. The middle, what I'm calling the middle, is an explanation in which you don't necessarily need the Nostratic hypothesis to explain why you do have these similarities. Okay, so this is a good thing, because if you say that you have Nostratic, you want to find more than just one set of similarities, right? You want to find more evidence than just one variable, right? I mean, you want to have multiple things that you can point to and say, this is why we think there was Nostratic. And there are other things that the Nostratic hypothesis has, especially there's been a lot of genetic work outside of linguistics, which seems to indicate that in terms of tribal migration, that Nostratic might not be far off the mark. However, there is still this other explanation that sort of meshes well with the mother argument, or not the mother argument, but the mother pattern, the nasal pattern in mother. Basically, it's this. If you think about these words for mother, including a nasal, and especially a bilabial nasal, like and you think about some of the first words that babies have to learn, or the first sounds that babies have to learn, let's say it that way, you realize that babies generally will have to suckle, and therefore some of the first sounds that they may come across as they're experimenting with their vocal apparatus are M-like sounds, right? Putting the lips together and vibrating the vocal folds. It produces a right? Now, if languages are basing their words for mother upon perhaps output from children. So children are sort of learning how to speak, and they just start making these sounds and babbling. And one of the sounds they make is ma, right? Ma, essentially a fairly open vowel and a bilabial nasal. That gives you an interesting way to look at this, because it says that the reason that we have all these words having this M at the beginning, having to do with mother and having to do with milk and things like this, is not because they all necessarily came from one language, but the fact is that these are all words having to do with children, and it's in our nature to think children are real cute, and we like looking at children, listening to children, and hearing what they say. And if you're a new mother and your baby starts saying ma, and whatever culture you live in, their language, this is thousands upon thousands of years ago, and their language hasn't developed enough to have a word for mother, and the kids start saying ma, and Sally over there has a child who's also saying something like ma, and you have to say, hey, what should we call ourselves? Then you might end up saying mother, or ma in that case, right? Something having to do with an M in any event. So it says that the fact that you have these patterns is sort of epiphenomenal, right? So the actual phenomenon is the fact that babies are producing these types of sounds based on having to breastfeed and suckle, and having to learn to move their mouths in that manner, and therefore you end up with these patterns as an end result. But you see, you no longer have to say that they all came from the same language. That's the crucial part. So the two different arguments in a nutshell. One, you're saying that babies produce these sounds as a result of having to suckle, and therefore words having to do with mothering or breastfeeding or milk start with these sounds, because it's essentially adults mimicking the children, right? Because these are the contexts in which these words have to be used, is regarding children, right? And you find these patterns then are epiphenomenal to the phenomenon of mimicking children in this way, right? So language A, they listen to their kids and they say, hey, they sounded like they're saying a sound. Language B, hey, they sounded like they're saying an sound, so we'll use an sound in this word. Language A and language B never talk to each other. They just came to the same conclusion because it's a biological fact that children have to suckle in that way. Okay, that's argument A. Argument B, Nostratic. Some language, whether it was Nostratic or some other language way back in the day, made an arbitrary decision to have an at the beginning of a word for milk or to suckle. And that has been passed down to every language, hence. So two very different arguments. Both have interesting points. I personally am more inclined to believe argument A. In other words, that there is that the patterns are epiphenomenal to some other, possibly biological factor. But to do good science, you have to be open to all possibilities. So Nostratic is certainly not out. It's interesting to see where that kind of stuff is going, and the Nostratic hypothesis actually leads well into a discussion of genetic research dealing with migration patterns, which has backed up some linguistic data, and especially backed up the MonoGenesis hypothesis, which of course is closely intertwined with the Nostratic hypothesis. And that is a topic for another episode, and also a topic suggested by our listeners, so that one will be coming soon. Alright, so I hope that's been interesting. I know it's a little bit out there. Historical linguistics kind of always is, because you don't have a lot of real-world data to work with once you get past a certain point, and especially if you're talking about things like Nostratic, which is essentially would be in the Paleolithic period, if it existed. Certainly there's no written records of it, and so it's you're having to first start with something like Indo-European, where there's definitely no written records, and then go to the mother of that, and the mother of that, and the mother of that, and so on and so forth, and you have to go so far back that it's all essentially conjecture and speculation, but nonetheless it is interesting, and I hope you found it so. Alright, so that's all I have today. Please keep sending me comments and or questions. I really do enjoy reading them and writing back to you guys. You can either write to me on Twitter @LinguistChris or on Gmail, linguistchris@gmail.com. Thanks again.